The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.
In this video we're going to show you how a lateral flow test works using the example of a pregnancy test. This first video we've just got some snapshots and it just shows a positive test with a positive sample with the hormone that we're trying to detect in the sample, and then this second video shows a negative result where we have a sample with no hormone present, none of the HCG is present that we're trying to detect. Now we're going to try and explain this with some animation and just looking at what's actually going on in detail to explain how this works. A lateral flow test is a form of immunoassay that uses antibodies to detect a specific analyte. So in the initial setup we have different types of antibodies. First of all, we have some coloured antibodies that are mobile and can move around the substrate, and these antibodies are specific to the analyte that we're trying to detect. So in the case of a pregnancy test, that is the hormone HCG. Then we have a fixed line of antibodies that are also specific to the analyte we're trying to detect. Again, for a pregnancy test, that is HCG. So these antibodies are in a fixed position on the substrate, and they're bonded to that position so they can't move about, and they will also bind to the hormone that we're trying to detect. The final line of antibodies are antibodies that will bind to the coloured antibodies, the coloured mobile antibodies, and so typically they will be a different species of antibodies. So if the coloured antibodies are from a rabbit, we might have then some rat antibodies that are anti-rabbit antibodies in that fixed position. Then when we add a sample, we've got a liquid drop here that's going to go onto the substrate. Once that goes onto the porous substrate, the HCG kind of goes onto the substrate and starts to move along by capillary action. When the HCG reaches the coloured antibodies, they will bind to the antibodies and start to move along. Some of them will get trapped at the first line because there's a binding interaction not only with the coloured antibodies but also with the fixed antibodies. So they're both binding to the HCG analytes there, and some of them will end up going past and they will get bound at the second line. That second line is a control line, and it tells us that the test has worked, that the antibodies have actually gone past the first line being the test line. So in this case it's a positive result because the antibody was present, and we get a coloured line at the test line, and that is because the HCG not only bound to the coloured antibodies but also to the fixed anti-HCG antibodies, and the control line is confirming that everything worked properly. If we run the test again, but this time without the hormone present, then when the liquid goes onto the substrate, it will again start to move things along by capillary action. The coloured antibodies will move along, but this time there won't be any binding events at the test line, there'll only be binding events at the control line. So again, the control line will become coloured to confirm that the test has worked, but the test line stays colourless because the HCG hormone wasn't present, and we can't have this cooperative binding event that causes the colour formation at the test line. So we can also see the same thing happening in the video where we're actually applying a sample to the lateral flow test, and in this first video we have a positive sample that contains the HCG, and we can see the colour move along. That's the coloured antibodies being moved along by capillary action. Once the sample reaches the coloured antibodies, not only is it kind of the liquid moving those antibodies along, but also the HCG is binding to those antibodies. Once we reach the test line, then that line becomes coloured because of this cooperative binding event with the fixed antibodies at that position, and then as it continues we also get a binding event at the control line, and that is because some of the antibodies have gone past and been bound to that control line, just to show that the test has worked. And again, remember that binding event doesn't depend on the presence of HCG, because it's just those fixed antibodies at the control line are binding to the coloured antibodies. The next video shows the lateral flow test being used with a negative sample, so there's no HCG present in this liquid. Once it's applied to the lateral flow test, we can see the coloured antibodies moving along. We can see the kind of flow and we can see the pink colour moving along the test. But on this occasion, the test line doesn't become coloured, and that's because there's no HCG present, and we don't get this cooperative binding event where the antibodies can get fixed to that position. But we do still see the control line forming a colour, and again that is confirming that the test has worked and that the antibodies have actually moved along successfully, that the liquid has moved along successfully, and that everything's worked correctly, and it just confirms that it really is a negative result and that we've got this binding event to show that everything has worked correctly.